The ferry's groan was a mournful thing, a sound Dean had come to associate with the last vestiges of the mainland receding into a gray blur. He stood on the deck, the salt spray a cold lash across his face, his gaze fixed on the approaching island. It was a jagged silhouette, barely discernible through the shroud of perpetual fog that clung to its craggy shores like a damp, suffocating blanket. This was it, the place his grandfather had called home. The place Dean hoped would offer a stark, unyielding solitude to match the one already carved deep within him. The journey had been long, each mile a deliberate severance from the life he'd left behind. Grief had hollowed him out, leaving an echo where his laughter used to reside. He carried it with him, a heavy, invisible weight that settled in his chest, making each breath feel like an effort. But beneath the sorrow, a flicker of something else persisted. A stubborn determination to survive, to map a new existence, even if it meant charting a course through the bleakest of territories. There was no welcoming committee, no bustling port, just a lone, weathered dockhand, his face etched with the harshness of the elements, who merely grunted a direction towards a narrow, overgrown track. Dean disembarked, his worn rucksack slung over one shoulder, a battered duffel in his hand. The air was thick with the scent of brine and decaying seaweed, a raw, primeval smell that seemed to seep into his clothes, his skin. The track was less a path and more a suggestion, winding precariously along the cliff edge. As he walked, the fog thickened, reducing the world to a small, damp circle around him. He felt an odd sense of exposure, as if the island itself were watching him, a vast, indifferent eye. He walked for what felt like an hour, the track climbing higher, the wind picking up, tugging at his clothes. Through a brief thinning of the mist, he caught sight of it, a hulking skeletal structure dominating a section of the coastline, the derelict factory. Its rusted iron skeleton clawed at the sky, broken windows like vacant eyes staring out at the unforgiving sea. It was a monument to industry's failure, a testament to abandonment, and it radiated an unsettling aura of decay. He quickened his pace, eager to put it behind him. Finally, the path crested, and there it was, the lighthouse keeper's cottage. It stood alone, a squat stone sentinel against the relentless elements, the lighthouse itself a towering silent sentinel behind it. He pushed open the heavy, salt-warped door. It groaned in protest, a sound that echoed unnervingly in the empty space. Dust motes danced in the sparse light that filtered through the grimy windows. His grandfather's presence, or rather his absence, was palpable. A single faded oil lamp sat on a small table. A map of the local coastline, curled at the edges, pinned to the wall above it. Dean dropped his bags, the thud echoing. He ran a hand over the rough-hewn mantelpiece, dust clinging to his fingertips. This was his sanctuary now, his prison, his blank canvas. He walked through the small rooms, each one sparsely furnished, each one carrying the weight of a life lived and ended. The bedroom contained a narrow cot, a sturdy chest of drawers, and a single small window overlooking the churning gray expanse of the sea. As he stood by the window, watching the waves crash against the rocks below, a sound reached him. It wasn't the wind, nor the gulls. It was a low, resonant thrum, a vibration that seemed to come from deep within the earth, or perhaps the ocean itself. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, a bass note that resonated more in his bones than in his ears. He strained to hear it again, but it faded, leaving only the relentless roar of the surf. He told himself it was just the island settling, the old house groaning. He had to. He had come here for a fresh start, not to chase phantoms. But then, out of the corner of his eye, a flicker. A movement in the periphery of his vision, just beyond the window's frame, in the swirling fog near the cliff edge. He turned sharply, his breath catching, but there was nothing. Only the shifting mist, the gray expanse. He stared for a long moment, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He was tired, he reasoned. The journey, the grief, the sheer isolation. It was playing tricks on his mind. He was determined not to let it. This island was to be his refuge, a place where he could finally begin to heal. And it had finally arrived. It was a jagged silhouette, barely discernible through the thickening mist. A place that felt less like a destination and more like the end of the world. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of salt, damp stone, and something else. Something metallic and faintly briny, a smell Dean couldn't quite place. His grandfather's presence was palpable in the worn armchair by the hearth, the stack of ancient charts on a mildewed table, the faint, lingering aroma of pipe tobacco that still clung to the fabric of the faded curtains. Dean ran a hand over the rough-hewn mantelpiece, the silence of the place pressing in on him. A heavy blanket. He had sought solitude, and solitude, it seemed, had found him in abundance. The first oddity struck him that very evening. He had spent the day unpacking, arranging his own sparse belongings, trying to impose some order on the chaos of abandonment. As dusk bled into night, painting the sky in bruised purples and grays, he walked down to the small pebbled beach below the cottage. The tide, he noted, was unusually high, reaching further up the shingle than any tide chart he'd ever studied would suggest. Dean, a man who understood the intricate dance of currents and lunar pull, felt a prickle of unease. He watched for a long time, the water receding for a moment only to surge back with renewed, unnatural vigor, as if driven by some hidden, rhythmic pulse beneath the waves. He chalked it up to a localized anomaly, perhaps an unusual storm surge far out to sea, but the explanation felt thin even to his own ears. A low, sibilant sigh carried on the wind, weaving through the rattling window panes. It wasn't the shriek of the gulls or the mournful keen of the wind itself. This was different, a sound that seemed to coalesce from the very air, formless yet distinct, like hushed voices speaking a language he couldn't quite grasp. He paused, a mug of cooling tea in his hand, listening. He'd seen it on his approach, a hulking monument to failed industry. Now the wind seemed to carry echoes from its decaying structure, a mournful chorus. He shook his head, dismissing it as the acoustics of the old cottage. The wind funneled through the gaps in the stone. Later, while attempting to clear out the small, cluttered study that had once been his grandfather's, Dean discovered the journal. It lay tucked away in a sea chest, beneath a tangle of fishing nets and rusty tools, its leather cover warped and swollen from water damage. The pages within were stiff, some fused together, others brittle and crumbling at the edges. His grandfather's handwriting, usually precise and neat on the old charts Dean remembered from childhood, was here a frantic scrawl, often bleeding into the water-stained paper. He carefully pried open the journal, the scent of mildew and brine rising from its pages. The entries were disjointed, rambling, filled with increasingly erratic observations about the sea, the moon, and the peculiar behavior of the island's wildlife. But it was the sketches that truly stopped him. Crude, almost childish, yet deeply unsettling, they depicted distorted, vaguely humanoid figures with too many limbs, or eyes that seemed to glow from impossible depths. Tentacles, thick and rope-like, snaked through many of the drawings, often reaching, grasping. And then there were the words, repeated over and over, sometimes underlined with furious intensity. The deep song. Dean traced the phrase with a trembling finger. What was the deep song? His grandfather had been a practical man, a lighthouse keeper, not prone to flights of fancy. One entry, written in a hand that seemed to shake even on the page, read, "It sings. From beneath the currents, it sings, and the tide answers." He closed the journal, the heavy thud echoing in the small room. Rationalization. He needed to rationalize this. His grandfather had been old, isolated. Perhaps the solitude had taken its toll, conjuring specters from the depths of his own mind. That was it. He was projecting. But as he looked out the window, the gray expanse of the ocean seemed to pulse with a hidden life. The waves crashing against the shore with an insistent rhythm that sounded, to his suddenly hyper-aware ears, eerily like a slow, deep breath. And from the direction of the derelict factory, a gust of wind carried with it a faint, almost imperceptible murmur, like a distant, distorted hum. The island was not merely desolate. It felt aware. Dean woke with a start, the morning light a pale, grudging smear against the window pane. The memory of his grandfather's journal, with its frantic scrawl and grotesque sketches, clung to him like a damp shroud. He had tried to dismiss it, to file it away under elderly eccentricity. But the images persisted, gnawing at the edges of his calm. He needed answers, something concrete to anchor his back to the world he understood. The rational mind demanded evidence, demanded explanation beyond the feverish scribblings of a man consumed by solitude. He spent the morning poring over the few books he'd found in the cottage. Local histories, tide charts, and a slim volume on island folklore. The folklore book, yellowed and brittle, held the most unsettling entries. It spoke of the deep ones, not as mere myth, but as ancient beings revered and feared by the island's earliest settlers. There were tales of a submerged city, its spires supposedly visible on nights of extreme low tide, though no cartographer had ever charted such a place. And then, the whispers of a pact, a necessary exchange, a peace maintained through offerings to ensure bountiful fishing in calm seas. The book was vague, skirting around the specifics, but the implication was clear. The islanders had made a deal with something vast and powerful beneath the waves. This newfound information sent a shiver down Dean's spine, a cold tendril reaching from the page into his own thoughts. He retrieved his grandfather's journal, its worn leather cover feeling suddenly heavier. Rereading the entries, the frantic energy of the words now seemed less like madness and more like a desperate attempt to document an encroaching reality. The crude sketches of undulating forms, once dismissed as abstract monsters, now resonated with the folklore's descriptions of the deep ones. His grandfather had written of the tribute, of the rising tide of hunger, and of the broken promise. The phrase, "the pact," appeared multiple times, underlined with furious strokes. This wasn't just an old man's delusion. It was a fragmented account of a shared, terrifying history. The need for more information, for something definitive, drove Dean out of the cottage. The island's small settlement boasted little in the way of a public archive, but a conversation with the proprietor of the general store, a grizzled woman whose family had lived on the island for generations, yielded a lead. Old records, you say? Most of what's left is down at the old fish processing plant. Been derelict for decades, but some of the old town council stuff got moved there after the fire at the original hall. Might find some dusty ledgers. The derelict factory stood on the north side of the island, a hulking silhouette against the gray sky. Its rusted, corrugated iron walls groaned in the perpetual sea wind, and the air around it was thick with the metallic tang of decay and the briny scent of forgotten fish guts. Dean pushed open a sagging steel door, its shriek echoing through the vast, empty space. The concrete floor was cracked and strewn with debris. Broken crates, tangled fishing nets, and the skeletal remains of forgotten machinery. He navigated through the labyrinthine interior, his footsteps crunching on loose gravel and shards of glass. Eventually, in a corner piled high with mildewed furniture and forgotten tools, he found what he was looking for. Several wooden crates marked with faded stencils containing stacks of ledgers and bound documents. The paper was stiff with age, the ink faded but legible. He carefully extracted a few, blowing dust from their covers. One ledger, bound in thick scarred leather, caught his eye. Its title, barely decipherable, read, Island Provisions and Tributes, 1887-1932. Dean's breath hitched. Tributes? These weren't just fishing records. They were accounts of a ritualistic exchange. Some entries detailed specific quantities of harvested marine life, but others simply noted the passage or the quiet gift, alongside dates coinciding with unusually calm seas or exceptionally abundant hauls. A diagram, crudely drawn on one page, depicted a stylized, multi-limbed creature being offered something by tiny human figures. The creature in the diagram bore an uncanny resemblance to the things his grandfather had sketched. Dean returned to the cottage as dusk bled across the sky. The ledgers clutched tightly in his arms. The information was overwhelming, a tidal wave of unsettling truths. That night, sleep offered no refuge. He saw glimpses of structures, cyclopean and seaweed-choked, rising from the profound depths, and felt an unbearable longing, a pull towards them that was both terrifying and strangely seductive. He awoke gasping, tangled in his sheets, the taste of salt on his tongue. He swung his legs out of bed, needing to ground himself in reality. His bare foot met something cool and slick on the floorboards. He looked down. A faint, ethereal glow emanated from the floor near the skirting board. A patch of something translucent and gelatinous, like a cluster of alien grapes, pulsed with a soft green-blue light. He knelt, his hand trembling as he reached out. Bioluminescent algae. But how? And why here, inside his cottage, miles from the nearest tide pool? He looked closer and saw not just one patch, but several, scattered in the corners of the room, on the underside of his bedside table, even clinging to the rim of his grandfather's old porcelain wash basin. Each tiny patch pulsed with its own faint, sickly light, like silent, watchful eyes. The entity, it seemed, was not content to merely stir beneath the waves. It was already here, inside, a creeping, luminous infestation. The island was not just holding a secret, it was alive with it, and it was reaching for him. Light struggled through the broken roof panels, illuminating drifts of dust and debris. Machinery, rusted beyond recognition, stood like skeletal giants draped in cobwebs. He moved carefully, his boots crunching on broken glass and what felt like dried fish scales. This place had been a cannery once, his grandfather's sparse notes indicated, before it was abandoned decades ago. Yet the air felt strangely charged, as if something had only just left or was about to arrive. He found a small, walled-off office in a corner, its door hanging by a single hinge. Inside, a wooden desk lay overturned, its drawers scattered. One was still intact, jammed beneath a pile of waterlogged ledgers. Dean knelt, pulling at it. It resisted, then gave way with a splintering groan, revealing a hidden compartment. His breath hitched. Inside, nestled amongst yellowed newspaper clippings about a series of unexplained disappearances from the island 50 years prior, was a small, leather-bound journal. It wasn't his grandfather's usual meticulous hand. This script was hurried, frantic, almost illegible in places. Alongside it lay a crude, tarnished silver amulet, shaped like a distorted, multi-limbed star, and a small, brittle bundle of dried seaweed, and something that looked like petrified barnacles, tied with a length of rough twine. He recognized the symbol on the amulet from the strange carvings on the stone monolith he'd found earlier. A shiver traced its way down his spine. His grandfather had been involved in something far deeper than simple island living. The clippings spoke of fishermen lost at sea, their boats found empty, and a strange mass hysteria that had gripped the islanders. He pocketed the journal and the amulet, the seaweed bundle feeling oddly warm against his palm. The sweet, cloying smell in the factory seemed to intensify, wrapping around him. He felt an intense, disquieting urge to leave. Back at the cottage, the gray light had begun to fade. The journal lay open on his kitchen table, its brittle pages filled with fragmented entries, increasingly desperate. It stirs. The tide brings the whispers. Offerings must be made. One entry detailed a specific location, a small cove on the eastern side of the island, mentioning the stone altar. Dean felt a knot tighten in his stomach. His grandfather hadn't just been trying to ward something off. He might have been feeding it. He went to wash his hands, the lingering scent of the factory clinging to him. As he looked into the small, speckled mirror above the sink, his reflection seemed to waver. He blinked, shaking his head. The image snapped back to normal. Just Dean, tired and pale. A trick of the light, he told himself, or perhaps the stress of the journal. It was subtle at first, a vibration in the floorboards, a faint thrumming in his teeth. He walked from room to room, trying to locate its source. It wasn't the wind, nor the generator, nor the old pipes. It seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere, a deep, hypnotic frequency that resonated in his bones. He was in the living room, trying to decipher a particularly frantic entry, when a heavy brass compass, a family heirloom that had sat on the mantelpiece since his arrival, slid an inch across the polished wood, as if nudged by an invisible hand. Dean froze, his gaze fixed on the compass. Then a small, intricate porcelain figurine of a mermaid, another of his grandfather's trinkets, tilted precariously on a shelf and crashed to the floor, shattering into a dozen pieces. The sound was sharp, unnatural, cutting through the droning hum. It wasn't a draft, wasn't the house settling. Something was here, inside with him. He backed away slowly, his eyes scanning the room, but saw nothing. The hum intensified, vibrating through the very air, making his ears ache. He felt a sudden, profound drop in temperature, like walking into an ice cave. It moved, not like a shadow cast by light, but with an internal fluidity, like ink blooming in water. It was vaguely humanoid, taller than Dean, and impossibly thin, its edges blurring and reforming. It was not solid, not truly present, but undeniably there. He could feel its proximity, a pressure in the air, a sense of vast, ancient hunger. He instinctively raised the tarnished silver amulet he'd found, clutching it tightly. For a moment, it held its ground, a silent, menacing presence. Dean stood trembling, the amulet hot against his palm, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. It had been real. It had been here. The hum continued, a constant, insidious reminder that while the immediate threat had receded, it had not gone. The derelict factory still clung to Dean's senses, a phantom echo of decay. He'd left it hours ago, the rusted corrugated iron walls and the reek of forgotten fish guts etched into his memory. The air in the lighthouse cottage, usually thick with the scent of salt and old paper, now seemed tainted by that industrial rot, a persistent metallic tang under the briny freshness. The vast emptiness of the factory, the way the wind had groaned through its skeletal frame, had felt like a void waiting to swallow him. Back in the relative warmth of the cottage, Dean forced himself to focus. He'd spent days poring over its cryptic entries, the looping, hurried script often dissolving into sketches of symbols he couldn't decipher. But tonight, after the unsettling visit to the factory, a new urgency propelled him. He ran a finger over an entry dated decades ago. The ink faded to sepia. The tides pull, the tides call. He watches, ever so patient. Dean had initially dismissed these as the ramblings of a lonely old man, perhaps driven to eccentricity by isolation. But now, he reread them through a different lens, a lens warped by the strange occurrences on the island, by the growing pressure in his skull. Further down the page, a series of symbols appeared, drawn with a heavier hand, almost carved into the paper. Below them, a hurried scrawl. The balance must be maintained. The offering. Not blood, but focus. The mind's eye. A shield. Dean's breath caught. Offering? Shield? This wasn't merely observation. His grandfather hadn't just been documenting a local legend. He had been an active participant. He flipped forward, pages rustling like dry leaves. More symbols, more hurried notes. The deep song grows louder. It seeks entrance. The pact holds, but weakens. He tries to sing back. It wasn't just a metaphor, was it? As if in answer, a low thrum began to resonate through the cottage. Then it intensified, a low, guttural murmur that swelled and receded, following an unseen rhythm. The deep song. He knew it instinctively. It was the sound his grandfather had written about, the sound that sought entrance. Dean pressed his hands against his temples, trying to push the sound away. It felt like cold water seeping into the cracks of his thoughts, diluting his clarity. The lamp flame seemed to waver, its light struggling against an invisible current. He blinked, rubbing his eyes, but the distortions persisted. A stack of old charts on a shelf seemed to ripple, the parchment breathing in and out. The familiar contours of the room began to subtly shift, the lines of the walls wavering, the very air taking on a viscous quality. No. He forced his gaze back to the journal, desperate for an anchor. His eyes darted across the pages, searching for anything that could explain this, anything to fight it. Then he saw it, an entry almost hidden by a fold in the page, written in a different, more urgent hand. Below the light, the true ward. Keep it locked. Keep it silent. Below the light. The lighthouse itself. Dean had explored the upper levels, the spiral staircase, the lantern room, but the base, the very foundation, had always seemed impenetrable, just solid rock and ancient stone. He had dismissed it as a simple, sturdy base. But the journal's words, coupled with the insistent thrumming in his head, suggested otherwise. Driven by a sudden, desperate clarity, Dean pushed away from the desk. The floorboards felt strangely soft beneath his boots, as if the wood itself were yielding. He stumbled towards the narrow wooden door that led from the living quarters into the base of the lighthouse tower. He ran his hands along the rough-hewn walls, searching for any seam, any irregularity. He swept them away, revealing a faint outline, a hairline crack in the stone that suggested a hidden seam, almost perfectly camouflaged. He pressed against it, then pushed, straining. A gust of stagnant, heavy air, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something ancient and metallic washed over him. It was a smell that spoke of long-buried things, of things that should never see the light. Beyond the narrow opening, a set of crude stone steps descended into the black. The deep song intensified, pulsing now, almost a tangible pressure against his eardrums. He stood at the threshold, the journal's words echoing in his mind. The true ward. Keep it silent. His grandfather had been protecting something, or keeping something imprisoned. And Dean, in his quest for answers, had just found the way in. Below the light, the lighthouse itself. He had dismissed its base as solid rock and ancient stone, an impenetrable foundation. But now he saw. A hairline fissure in the rough-hewn granite, barely visible beneath the decades of salt spray and sea moss, traced a forgotten seam. His fingers, guided by an instinct born of dread, pressed against it. A grinding sigh of stone on stone, a mechanism long dormant, groaned to life. He stepped through, the stone slab hissing shut behind him, plunging him into absolute blackness. It wasn't directly beneath the lighthouse. It angled sharply, burrowing beneath the island's crust, away from the familiar structure. The floor was uneven, slick with moisture. The thrumming grew stronger as he descended, a pulse beneath the earth. The tunnel widened, the rough-hewn stone giving way to crumbling brick-lined walls, then to reinforced concrete. This wasn't a natural cave system. This was engineered. He emerged into a vast, echoing space. His flashlight swept across rusted machinery, towering silhouettes of defunct presses and collapsed gantries. This was the derelict factory his grandfather's cryptic notes had alluded to, a place shrouded in the island's forgotten history. The thrumming intensified here, resonating through the very floor, vibrating up through his boots and into his bones. His light found a wide, circular opening in the factory's concrete floor, protected by a railing of corroded iron. He approached cautiously, peering down. A deep shaft, descending into absolute blackness, from which the thrumming emanated with overwhelming force. It was no longer a pulse. It was a vast, resonant drone that seemed to vibrate his very eyeballs. He descended a steep, narrow staircase that hugged the inner wall of the shaft. The drone filled his head, erasing all other sound. His chest tightened, a pressure building behind his eyes. And there it was. Not an artifact, not a machine, but a wound in reality itself. It was a tear, a rift, a perfect circular aperture of absolute black, yet it emanated light. A deep, violet luminescence that seemed to absorb and distort the very air around it. It wasn't empty. Within its depths, something stirred. It was a vortex of non-Euclidean angles and shifting colors, a cosmic eye that seemed to perceive everything and nothing simultaneously. This was it. Its nature was not merely ancient, but primordial, a cosmic aberration that had merely touched this world. The thrumming, which he now understood as its very presence, became a deafening roar in his skull. He felt himself being pulled, not physically, but mentally, into the swirling depths. A vision exploded into his mind, raw and terrifying. He was no longer in the chamber. The island, his lighthouse, the entire world were mere specks, toys in an incomprehensibly vast, indifferent consciousness. He saw the ocean rise, not in a storm, but in a slow, inexorable exhalation, engulfing the island, the mainland, consuming everything. But it wasn't just water. The water itself was alive, a sentient, crushing weight, its depths filled with impossible shapes that writhed and pulsed with the same violet light. He was not being destroyed. He was being absorbed, his identity erased, his essence folded into the incomprehensible fabric of the entity. The vision snapped back violently. He stumbled backward, gasping, his lungs burning as if he had truly been drowned. The air in the chamber was suddenly thin, metallic. He clutched at his head, a searing pain behind his eyes. It wasn't just a threat to the island, or to his sanity. It was a threat to existence itself. A cosmic hunger that saw reality as merely another thing to consume. The pact, the forgotten history. It was all a prelude to this. A slow, patient encroachment. The entity was not merely stirring. It was awake, and it was reaching. It was a low, resonant hum, a sound he felt more than heard, a vibrational thrum that spoke of immense churning power beneath the earth. He knelt, fingers tracing the jagged hairline, the cold dampness of the rock seeping into his skin. A whisper, thin as a razor's edge, scraped against the inside of his skull. He flinched, scrambling back from the stone, his breath catching in his throat. It felt like an unwelcome guest had just stepped over his threshold, not into the lighthouse, but into the very core of his being. His hands trembled as he flipped through the brittle pages, searching for answers amidst his grandfather's increasingly frantic script. The scrawls grew wilder towards the end, the ink bleeding in places as if the old man's hand had shaken uncontrollably. Then a passage. It wasn't a ritual, not explicitly, but a desperate plea, an addendum to an earlier, more formal entry. The light draws them, yes, but the true binding, the anchor, is elsewhere. Not here, not in the stone beacon, but in the place of industry, where the iron groans and the ocean claims its due. The derelict factory, the secondary tether. Dean's mind raced. His grandfather had rarely spoken of it, always with a peculiar, almost fearful reverence. Could it be? Could the lighthouse, for all its symbolic power, merely be a decoy, a distraction while the true threat festered elsewhere? The thought was a bitter pill, but it offered a sliver of desperate hope. If the entity was trying to break through him, then perhaps there was a way to sever its connection, to seal whatever portal it was using to encroach upon reality. The fog had intensified, swallowing the narrow path that wound around the island, reducing visibility to mere feet. When he finally reached the derelict factory, it loomed out of the swirling mist like a forgotten leviathan, its skeletal remains silhouetted against the milky sky. The wind whistled through gaping holes in the corrugated iron roof, creating a mournful, drawn-out moan that echoed through the vast, empty space. The interior was a graveyard of defunct machinery, massive gears frozen in time, conveyor belts draped with decades of grime, and workbenches littered with corroded tools. He squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, fighting the nausea, the creeping certainty that he was not alone. This wasn't just a place, it was a conduit. He forced himself to focus, the journal clutched tightly in one hand. He found a section marked with a crude, blood-red symbol, a jagged, inverted triangle. The script here was almost illegible, a jumble of ancient words and symbols, but the intent was clear. A ritual, a way to seal the breach. It spoke of the great sacrifice, the offering of true severance. As Dean deciphered the fragmented lines, a terrible understanding dawned. It wasn't a material offering, not gold or blood in the traditional sense. It was something far more profound, more agonizing. The words implied a spiritual cost, a severing of a fundamental connection, a piece of oneself, a memory, or even a future. It was incomplete, the last few lines torn or deliberately obscured, but the implication was devastating. A terrible, soul-crushing sacrifice. He stood amidst the rusting echoes of industry, the journal trembling in his hands, the weight of his grandfather's desperate words pressing down on him. The derelict factory groaned around him, a symphony of decay and unseen forces. The final lines of the journal blurred before Dean's eyes, not from exhaustion, but from the brutal clarity they offered. It wasn't gold, not blood, not even a life in the conventional sense. The cost, the true offering, was a memory. The most precious, the most agonizing. It was the last echo of his partner's laugh, the feel of their hand in his, the vivid, aching image of their face. This was the entity's demand, not his death, but the death of what made him human, what made him him. As this terrible understanding settled, the island responded. The air, already thick with an unnatural chill, became a suffocating blanket. Outside the cottage windows, the fog didn't just thicken. It curdled, swirling in viscous tendrils that seemed to possess an almost deliberate motion, pressing against the glass like a hungry, formless face. The wind, a constant companion on the island, escalated into a banshee shriek, tearing at the eaves and rattling the very foundations of the lighthouse. It wasn't a storm, it was a tantrum, an ancient, malevolent will expressing its impatience. He stumbled to the window, peering into the maelstrom. The churning gray outside was punctuated by flashes of sickly green bioluminescence deep within the roiling waves, like monstrous eyes opening and closing beneath the churning surface. The familiar rock formations along the shore, usually stark and enduring, now seemed to writhe, their ancient surfaces slick with a viscous, dark slime that glistened faintly. He saw a gnarled cypress, usually steadfast against the elements, its branches now twisted into grotesque, supplicating forms, dripping with something that wasn't dew. This wasn't merely weather. It was the island itself succumbing, becoming an extension of the things stirring below. He closed his eyes, and for a terrifying moment, the image of his partner flickered, then began to fade, like a photograph curling in a flame. He snatched it back, clinging to the pain, clinging to the memory, for it was all he had left, and soon it would be the ultimate sacrifice. He forced his eyes open, the metallic tang of fear sharp on his tongue. He would not surrender. Not yet. He had come here to escape, to find solitude. But he had found something far worse. And now, he carried the burden of its counter. The journal's final cryptic passage wasn't just a revelation of cost. It was also a map, a set of instructions. Dean began to gather what he would need. A stout lantern, its beam cutting a weak circle against the encroaching gloom. A coil of rope, for what purpose he wasn't entirely sure, but the journal had mentioned binding. A small, crude fishing knife, its blade dull but serviceable, not for violence, but for a symbolic act. Each item felt heavy in his hands, imbued with the terrible gravity of his task. He pulled on his heaviest oilskins, the thick canvas providing little comfort against the biting wind that now seemed to claw at the cottage's very structure. Stepping outside, the world was a canvas of muted grays and greens, the air a tangible entity, pushing against him with unseen force. The sound of the ocean was a monstrous symphony, waves crashing against the cliffs with the force of a battering ram, sending plumes of spray high into the air. He pressed on, his boots sinking into the saturated ground, the wind a constant physical assault. Trees bent double, their branches thrashing like whips. He saw shapes in the fog, fleeting glimpses of something large and amorphous moving just beyond the edge of his vision, always retreating, always implying. He would not let it be taken without a fight. Finally, the skeletal silhouette of the derelict factory emerged from the swirling mists. The journal had been specific. The heart of the counter-ritual lay within its collapsing walls. This was where he would make his stand. This was where he would gather his remaining courage, armed with a terrible knowledge and a devastating choice. The journal lay discarded, its pages fluttering in a phantom breeze that stirred no dust. The true offering was not an external payment, but an internal amputation. The severing of a fundamental connection, not to the world, but to himself. The cost was a piece of his very essence, a sacrifice that would leave him hollowed, but perhaps, finally, free. The air in the cottage was thick, heavy with the entity's encroaching presence. The low hum, once a distant thrum, now vibrated through the floorboards, a guttural growl beneath the island's skin. The journal, cryptic in its final entries, hinted at a place of decay and forgotten industry, a crucible for the impossible, the derelict factory. He stepped out into a world swallowed by fog. The path to the factory, usually a clear line through sparse gorse, was a twisting, ill-defined track. He gripped the heavy, brine-stained iron bar he'd pried from the cottage wall, a crude but tangible anchor in a reality that felt increasingly fluid. The factory loomed out of the swirling gray, a skeletal silhouette of rust and shattered glass. Its colossal, gaping maw of an entrance seemed to breathe the same fetid air as the fog. Inside, the silence was profound, broken only by the drip of unseen moisture and the scuttling of some small, unseen things. The stench here was overwhelming. Ozone and decay, metallic tang and the damp, earthy smell of millennia. Dean's boots crunched on scattered debris, broken bricks, shards of rusted sheet metal, the brittle husks of insects. He moved deeper, guided by an instinct that felt alien, yet undeniable. The factory's interior was a labyrinth of rusting machinery, silent presses, and conveyor belts frozen in time. The scale of the place was immense, the ceiling lost in the gloom. Here, the entity's influence was palpable. The air shimmered, and for a terrifying moment, a distant wall seemed to ripple, its concrete surface behaving like water. He found the central chamber, a vast circular space where a massive rusted crucible stood, surrounded by skeletal cranes. This was it. This was where the first irreversible act had to occur. He placed the journal on the corroded lip of the crucible, its final pages still open. The ritual wasn't written out, but a terrible intuition guided him. The severing wasn't a physical act, but but a mental incision. He remembered the accident, the exact moment his world fractured, the faces of those he loved. He held onto it, clutched it, then, with a guttural cry that echoed through the vast space, he pushed. A searing internal pain flared, not like a burn, but like something vital being ripped from his soul. His knees buckled and he gasped, a raw, primal sound. It was gone. Not forgotten, not repressed, but severed. A part of him was simply missing. But the ritual wasn't complete. The true sealing had to happen at the lighthouse, the heart of the entity's growing breach. The fog had thickened further, a roiling, churning wall of gray that pressed in from all sides. The very ground seemed to vibrate, a deep, resonant thrum that resonated in his bones. The entity was enraged. The journey back to the lighthouse was a gauntlet. Objects shifted in the fog. Gnarled trees seemed to reach out with claw-like branches. Boulders appeared to move, blocking his path. His mind, now devoid of its most painful anchor, felt eerily calm, a terrifying clarity in the face of absolute chaos. The lighthouse stood silhouetted against a sky that was no longer gray, but a bruised, impossible purple, streaked with veins of sickly green. The air around the tower was thick, almost viscous, making each step a monumental effort. He could hear it now, a grinding, slurping sound that seemed to emanate from the very stone of the lighthouse. A sound that suggested unimaginable things stirring beneath the waves. The walls were slick with an unidentifiable grime, and the familiar smell of salt and old stone was replaced by that cloying, ancient stench. As he ascended, the entity's presence solidified. It wasn't a form, not truly. It was a pressure, immense and crushing, that threatened to collapse his lungs. It was a symphony of discordant sounds that grated on his nerves, a chorus of clicks and whistles that defied human anatomy. It was a visual distortion, a shimmering haze that made the very structure of the lighthouse seem to bend and warp, the glass panes of the lantern room rippling like water. He fought through it, each step an act of defiance. He reached the lantern room, the air here vibrating with an almost unbearable intensity. The light itself was a sickly, pulsating green, revealing the portal. A swirling vortex of impossible colors. A tear in reality that pulsed at the center of the room, drawing in the very light and air. The ancient mechanism for sealing it was built into the floor, a complex array of rusted levers and gears surrounding a central basin. His grandfather's journal had described it, but the final, crucial step was only now clear to him. With a primal roar, Dean lunged, his body screaming in protest against the crushing pressure. He slammed his hand onto the main lever, pulling it down with all his remaining strength. The gears shrieked, grinding, protesting. The vortex pulsed violently, its colors intensifying, threatening to explode. He felt tendrils, unseen but tangible, probing his mind, seeking purchase, trying to reestablish the connection he had so brutally severed. He fought back, his will a desperate, defiant shield. The final act. He plunged his hand into the central basin, pressing his palm against the rough, cold stone. He focused on the emptiness within him, the gaping chasm left by his sacrifice. A guttural shriek, not from him, but from the very air, tore through the lantern room. The vortex shuddered, then began to shrink, its impossible colors fading, collapsing in on themselves. The pressure lessened, the discordant sounds receded, replaced by a terrible, grinding groan as the portal fought against its closure. Dean felt a profound drain, as if the very last vestiges of his life force were being siphoned away. With a final shattering crack that echoed like thunder, the vortex snapped shut, replaced by a smooth, unblemished surface of ancient stone. The light in the lantern room flickered, then settled into its familiar, steady beam, cutting through the receding fog. The entity was gone for now. Dean slumped against the cold stone, victorious but profoundly, irrevocably broken. The profound personal sacrifice had been made. He was empty, a vessel, adrift in a world that would never feel the same. Not a sacrifice of blood or coin, but of self. It wanted the very anchor of his being, the grief that had shaped his reclusion, the memory of his wife's final fading smile. He stood by the window, watching the relentless fog lick at the cottage's foundations. The air, usually thick with the briny tang of the sea, now carried a faint, cloying sweetness, like decay hidden beneath blooming nightshade. The deep song, once a distant thrum, pulsed through the very floorboards, a resonant hum that vibrated in his teeth. It was an invitation, a siren call to a deeper, darker understanding. The map, his grandfather's crude sketch, lay open on the table, a stark X marking the derelict factory on the island's northernmost point. It was a place he'd avoided, its skeletal silhouette a constant, unwelcome presence on the horizon. Now it was his destination. He pulled on his oilskin coat, the familiar weight a small comfort against the enormity of his task. The lighthouse beam swept its arc, a futile defiance against the encroaching gray. The walk was a descent into a waking nightmare. The winding path, usually a familiar track of gnarled roots and damp earth, felt alien beneath his boots. The fog swirled closer, not merely obscuring, but distorting, twisting the familiar into grotesque shapes. Trees became hunched figures, their branches skeletal fingers reaching. It promised oblivion, peace, and a knowledge that would shatter the mind. He felt it probing, testing the edges of his sanity, seeking the weakness, the opening. He could feel the entity's presence now, not as a physical mass, but as an overwhelming pressure, a psychic weight that bore down on his skull. It was ancient, vast, indifferent. The derelict factory loomed, a jagged scar against the milky sky. Its broken windows were like empty eye sockets staring out at the desolate sea. The ground beneath his feet was littered with shards of glass and corroded metal, crunching with each step. He stepped inside. The vast space was a cathedral of decay. Pillars of rusted steel rose towards a ceiling riddled with holes, letting in slivers of the anemic light. Machinery, long since seized by corrosion, stood like forgotten titans, draped in cobwebs and the clinging damp. The deep song here was deafening, a roar that resonated through his bones, rattling his teeth. It was the sound of everything and nothing. Dean walked to the center of the factory floor, a vast expanse of cracked concrete. The pressure intensified, pushing down on him, trying to force him to his knees. He felt his mind stretching, tearing at the seams. The images of his wife, her laughter, her touch, her final breath, flashed before his eyes, vivid and agonizing. The entity was pulling, tugging at these precious, painful memories, trying to rip them from him. He closed his eyes, clenching his fists. This was it, the amputation. He couldn't fight it. He had to offer it willingly. With a guttural cry that tore from his chest, he focused on the core of his grief, the unshakable sorrow that had defined his life since her passing. He fell to his knees, gasping, a scream caught in his throat. The deep song reached a crescendo, a terrifying, beautiful roar of consumption. And then, slowly, it began to recede. When Dean finally opened his eyes, the derelict factory was still there, the decay unchanged. But the pressure was gone. The overwhelming sound had diminished to a faint, distant hum, a memory rather than a presence. He felt empty. Not entirely free, but profoundly, terrifyingly empty. The grief was gone. The sorrow was gone. But so too, it seemed, was the love, the vivid memory of her face, the warmth of her hand. He tried to recall her smile, but it was a blurred photograph, a concept, not a feeling. He was adrift, untethered. The island's curse had lifted, but he was no longer the man who had sought solace within its fogs. The deep song no longer called to him, for he had given it what it craved. He was the new guardian of its terrible secret, forever bound to the island, not by pact, but by the absence within him. The future stretched before him, an endless, silent expanse.